Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is Uncanny X-Men 7, cover dated September of 1964. The issue was written by Stan Lee, drawn by Jack Kirby, inked by Chick Stone, and lettered by Art Simic. Our issue opens up with a striking splash page, showing the X-Men posing with caps and diplomas. They're taking their graduation photos, as they've completed their normal prep school curriculum, and Professor X is confident that they've mastered their mutant powers. But this doesn't mean that the X-Men are disbanding, as the team will indeed live on, just without Professor X as its leader. Apparently he has some important matters to attend to, and will thus appoint a successor in his absence. But we'll have to wait to see who he picks, as the issue then shifts focus to a dilapidated mansion at the edge of town. It's the makeshift headquarters of the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, as their asteroid fortress was destroyed in issue 5 of this series. Magneto has just convened a meeting in one of the mansion's rooms, but only the Scarlet Witch and Mastermind have yet arrived. Thus the two mutants are alone together, giving Mastermind a perfect opportunity to confess his love for the Scarlet Witch. Except he doesn't truly love her, as he thinks that simply casting luxurious illusions will impress her. They unsurprisingly don't, and she thus coldly rejects his advances. But Mastermind is persistent, as he then transforms their room into a European terrace, and offers her the chance to travel around the world, without ever leaving the house. But still, the Scarlet Witch is nothing less than revolted by him, and openly yearns for Magneto's arrival instead. While she simply wants Magneto to take the attention away from herself, Mastermind assumes that she wants him to arrive because she's fallen in love with him. So being bitter and jealous, Mastermind then grabs a hold of the Scarlet Witch, and swears off Magneto as a cruel and heartless man. Yet he couldn't have said this at a worse time, as Magneto has overheard it, and responds by viciously slamming him into a nearby wall. He then puts Mastermind in his place, and remarks that he cares nothing for loyalty, but expects his Brotherhood to be fearful and obedient. But speaking of the Brotherhood, it's then that the rest of the team arrive on the scene. They had heard Mastermind being slammed into a wall, and rushed to see what was going on. Quicksilver especially came to check on his sister the Scarlet Witch, and make sure she was unharmed. Thus he discovers that she's completely fine, but warns Magneto that if any harm comes to her, he'll have to face his wrath. Magneto doesn't take Quicksilver's threat seriously, but for once, he doesn't snap back at him. Instead he simply reaffirms his pledge to protect them both, so long as they continue to obey him implicitly. But with that out of the way, and with the entirety of his Brotherhood now assembled, Magneto can begin his meeting. But before we learn his latest evil scheme, let's first return to Professor X, who's heading down a dark corridor of his vast mansion. Accompanying him is Scott Summers, also known as Cyclops. They're in an area of the mansion that's off limits to students, meaning Scott is the first of the X-Men to see what's really there. And what he sees is quite astonishing, as Professor X leads him to a large chamber that's similar to the Danger Room, but filled with a massive twisting machine. It's called Cerebro, after the Latin word for brain. It's an extrasensory perception machine, which can detect mutant brain waves. With it, Professor X can locate other mutants, both good and evil. But this doesn't make much sense, as using his telepathic power, Professor X can already locate other mutants. So the professor reveals Cerebro's true purpose, as it allows non-telepaths, like Scott, to locate mutants in his absence. And of course the reason Scott's being shown it, is because he's been chosen to lead the X-Men. Shocked, Scott questions if he's truly the best equipped to lead, as after all, the Beast is smarter, while the Angel is more aggressive. But the professor remains steadfast in his decision, as he claims that only Scott possesses the rare quality of leadership. So the matter is settled, and by next morning, the professor has left the mansion. The rest of the X-Men then learn of the professor's decision when, while getting ready to leave the mansion and celebrate their graduation, they enter the professor's office looking for Scott. And they indeed find him there, as he's already claimed the professor's desk, and is sifting through paperwork. Yet surprisingly, none of them are upset about being passed over, and instead graciously congratulate him on being chosen. He thanks them for their well wishes, but makes it clear that he never asked for the position, nor even wanted it. In fact, he claims that he was thinking of leaving the X-Men entirely, as although the professor has full faith in him, he still doesn't think that he's fully in control of his powers. But after speaking candidly with the professor, and after being reminded of his duty to mutant kind, he's decided to remain with the X-Men and become its leader. But this doesn't mean that he can't have some fun, as his teammates then ask him if he wants to go out. While grateful, Scott denies the offer, as it's now his duty to watch over the mansion. So while they depart for a fun day in New York City, he remains right where he is, and stands guard over their quiet home. So let's leave him to it, and shift focus back to Magneto, who's arrived at a busy carnival on the edge of town. He's searching for the Blob, a circus performer and powerful mutant, who nearly defeated the X-Men in issue 3 of this series. But it doesn't take him long to find him, as the lumbering mutant is in the middle of a performance. He's been tied to an elephant that's walking in the opposite direction, yet amazingly, the Blob remains completely motionless. This is his first mutant power, as he's able to root himself onto the ground, and as long as he maintains a semblance of concentration, can't possibly be moved. His second power is his invincible skin, as seemingly nothing can hurt him, not even a cannonball, shot from mere feet away. With these in mind, it's no wonder that Magneto wants to add the Blob to his Brotherhood. So after the performance is over, Magneto approaches the Blob and demands to speak with him. But before he says another word, he attempts to probe the Blob's mind with his own mental powers, yet encounters a powerful mental block. It was placed there by Professor X, as the Blob had learned the true identities of the X-Men. So the professor erased those memories from the Blob's mind, or so it seemed. But before Magneto can prod any further, the manager of the circus shows up and demands to know who he is, and why he's bothering his star performer. Magneto doesn't have time for any meddling humans, so instead of answering the questions, he traps the manager under a metal cage, and warns him against challenging his power. But the brash manager isn't one to back down from a fight, so instead of heeding the warning, he calls over a group of carnival workers, and orders them to attack Magneto. So the Brotherhood, who'd been hiding among the crowd, instinctively rush in and begin defending their leader. Take Quicksilver, who, like a bowling ball, crashes into and knocks over a bunch of carnies. But they're persistent, as they then grab some bats and mallets, and begin swinging at him. Yet while Quicksilver has no trouble dodging their attacks, it's actually Mastermind who takes them out, as he transforms their weapons into illusory snakes. He then makes it seem that a volcano has sprung up in the middle of the carnival, and this chaos sends them fleeing. But the battle's not over yet, as a final group of carnies then ambush Mastermind and the Scarlet Witch. And while the latter cowardly begs for his life, the Scarlet Witch stands her ground, and defeats them using her hex power. So with the carnies finally out of the way, Magneto then offers the Blob a chance to join his Brotherhood. But the massive mutant gives him the same answer that he'd given the professor when offered a spot on the X-Men. No. This obviously isn't the response that Magneto's looking for, so he urges the Blob to reconsider, and makes it clear that if he's not with the Brotherhood, then he's their enemy. But this threat doesn't intimidate the Blob, so to prove that he's not one to be messed with, he suddenly grabs a hold of Magneto, and briefly overpowers him with his immense strength. But the key word is brief, as Magneto then uproots the very ground that he's standing on, and sends him flying into a nearby trailer. In the ensuing collision, the Blob happens to crash his head in such a precise way, that the professor's mental block is jarred loose. Thus his memory is restored, and along with it, his hatred for the X-Men. Thus he immediately changes his mind, and agrees to join Magneto's Brotherhood. But with his brain activity now back to normal, the Blob's thoughts are quickly picked up by Cerebro. Thus Scott's alerted to the newfound threat, and scrambles to reassemble the X-Men. But that's not so easy, as they've scattered themselves across New York City. Take Bobby and Hank, who are relaxing at a coffee shop, and listening to some new age jazz. They're joined by an unnamed woman, who urges Hank to take off his shoes, as they're uncomfortably tight on his mutant feet. Normally, taking one's shoes off in public is considered indecent, but among the hippies, it's actually encouraged. In fact, the Bohemians are so enamored with his ape-like feet, that they decide to create a new cult in its honor. They call themselves the Barefoot Beats, and begin parading Hank as their new king. Meanwhile, Bobby's off in a corner flirting with a young waitress named Zelda. But their budding romance will have to wait, as it's then that Warren barges in, and tells Bobby and Hank of the red alert back at the mansion. So the two mutants hastily depart the cafe, and along with Jean, drive back to the mansion in Warren's sports car. Meanwhile, Blob and the Brotherhood have just arrived at an abandoned factory, where they plan to lure the X-Men into a trap. But speaking of the team, they've just made it back to the mansion, and are now scrambling to get ready for battle. And while they're struggling to slip on their socks and shoes, Cyclops is intently listening to a startling radio message. It's from Magneto, and he's just challenged the X-Men to meet him at the abandoned factory. While they could be walking into a trap, the X-Men know that they can't pass up an opportunity to confront their archenemy. So they quickly board their private helicopter and fly off to the factory. Once there, they spot the Blob, standing alone in an open field. He's of course there to lure them into a trap, but Cyclops knows this all too well. So instead of jumping out and attacking him, he simply keeps their helicopter hovering from a safe distance away, at least until they can spot the rest of the Brotherhood. But Magneto, who's hiding within the factory, doesn't have time for the X-Men's caution. So he takes matters into his own hands, and telekinetically rips the helicopter apart. But don't fret, as none of the X-Men are actually harmed in its destruction, and their falls are all broken by one of Iceman's signature slides. But this doesn't mean they're in the clear, as they're now standing toe-to-toe with the Blob. So the Angel's up first, as he grabs a piece of broken rotor blade, and tries to charge it at the Blob. But we've seen the Blob shrug off cannonballs, so this scrap of metal doesn't harm him in the least. And worse yet, it gives him an opportunity to lunge at the Angel, who he quickly pins with his immense strength. So the Beast, the physically strongest of the X-Men, steps in and tries to kick the Blob off of his teammate. But this strike proves as futile as the Angel's, for the Blob remains firmly rooted to the ground, and even manages to pin the Beast just as well. So Marvel Girl tries a different approach, as while keeping her distance, she tries to telekinetically yank the Blob off of her teammates. Yet the intense mental strain is too much for her to handle, and she only manages to raise the ground that the Blob's standing on a few inches. So just like that, 3 of the 5 X-Men have already been taken out of the fight, and it's now up to Cyclops and Iceman to somehow defeat the Blob. But they've got more than just him to worry about, as it's then that Magneto emerges from within the factory, and releases a volley of magnetic torpedoes. While Cyclops normally takes care of projectiles with his optic beam, he's now hesitant to fire, as he fears that he'll accidentally detonate the missiles. So instead of blasting away, he orders Iceman to create a curved tube that can redirect their path. And sure enough, this trick actually works, as it sends the torpedoes harmlessly whizzing into the sunset. Except it doesn't, as Magneto simply turns them around, and sends them right back to Iceman. With no time to react, Cyclops steps in and blasts at the ground beneath Iceman's feet, managing to carve a pit that forces his teammate under the path of the speeding torpedoes. Meanwhile, the Beast and Angel are still trying to wrestle themselves free from the Blob. But realizing that he can't do it with strength alone, the Beast scoops a glob of mud out of the ground, and wails it at the Blob's face. Instinctively, the massive mutant releases his unbreakable grip, and starts rubbing his eyes. So the Beast's now free, yet instead of running away, he actually moves in for another strike. And this time it works, as the Blob cannot root himself for blows he's unprepared for. But as for the also free Angel, he's turned his attention to Magneto, who's erected a barrier of flying torpedoes around himself. But the Angel's trained for situations like this, and maneuvers around the missiles with ease. Yet he gets careless, and flies low to the ground. This leaves him open to Quicksilver, who whizzes onto the field and strikes him with a mighty blow. So Cyclops steps in and tries to blast the speedy mutant, but even his beams are too slow to catch him. The only one who can stop Quicksilver is Marvel Girl, as she telekinetically raises him off the ground, and prepares to drop him into the arms of the Beast. But just as she lets him go, the Scarlet Witch uses her hex power to shove the Beast out of position. Thus when Quicksilver hits the ground, he quickly gets up and whizzes out of the way. While that's going on, Iceman's just managed to freeze the Blob in a block of ice, seemingly restraining him for good. And now that that's settled, he can join the fight against Quicksilver, as he tries to trip the mutant with an ice blast. But Quicksilver's simply too fast, and evades the blast to regroup with Magneto. Thus at this point, all of the X-Men are huddled together, as are Magneto and his Brotherhood. Cyclops realizes that this can only mean one thing. It's time for the final showdown. But before either side can unleash their attack, the Blob astonishingly breaks his way out of the block of ice, and begins furiously stomping his way towards the X-Men. This is just the opportunity that Magneto needs, as while the X-Men are distracted with the Blob, he once again unleashes a volley of magnetic torpedoes. Yet the X-Men react just in time, as they all cower behind the massive bulk of the Blob. Thus he takes the full brunt of the missile's power, and perhaps for the first time, is truly knocked off of his feet. But Magneto's plan has fallen apart all the same, and he quickly ushers his Brotherhood into a flying car hidden within the factory. He of course abandons the Blob, and escapes to confront the X-Men another day. But their battle wasn't a complete failure, as Magneto's realized that the professor wasn't there, and nor was he mentally monitoring the situation. Thus he can adjust his strategy for the next battle, knowing that the X-Men now fight alone. So that just leaves the Blob. But he's done fighting. In fact, he's done with all of it. He's done meddling with other mutants. And he's especially done trusting them. He just wants to go back to the carnival where he belongs. So he turns down another opportunity to join the X-Men, and simply walks away. The issue subsequently ends as the X-Men realize that they're stranded without their helicopter. So, like everyone else that's lost, they send out the Angel to hail a taxi. That concludes Uncanny X-Men 7, and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was a solid, but somewhat tired story. While I certainly enjoyed seeing the Blob battle the X-Men again, this is the fourth issue in a row where they fight Magneto and his Brotherhood, only for the villains to escape at the last minute. At this point, Magneto's been the villain in 5 of the 7 X-Men issues. While I do enjoy him as a character, I think it's about time that the X-Men face someone new. Thus I'm left excited knowing that the next issue will finally introduce a new villain, Eunice the Untouchable. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.